Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rich West. I'm the first vice president and the primary program planner, of course, for this year's 2011 NCA convention. So welcome if you haven't been welcomed before. And especially welcome to the Carroll C. Arnold Distinguished Lecture, which is sponsored by our longtime friends at Pearson Higher Education. As a matter of fact, if you haven't been there, you should probably get to the exhibit hall and support the Pearson Higher Education group in as many ways as possible. And by the way, if you haven't also figured out, we have what is called an artist gallery, which is outside of the exhibit hall. Well, we have about 12 or 15 artisans, local artisans, who we decided to kind of turn it around a little bit this year and have them be able to display different kind of mediums, different kind of artistic genres. And these are people who are local, independent, who have been struggling to some extent. So we actually wanted to have their voice honored in this association's convention. So please take advantage of their talents and discuss some of their artistic talents and perhaps even make a purchase or two. So here we are, one of our prestigious of all honors related to this association. And what I'd like to do is to start it with a story, and it's a true story. It was Sunday morning, NCA, San Francisco, last year. I was sitting in the lobby around 9 in the morning, eating a really dry bagel from Starbucks, and I was watching some people prepare for a panel, others check out the hotel, and still others trying to figure out how they managed to even get up so early. The seating area at the Hilton, if you recall that hotel, some of you may remember, was very tight. There weren't a lot of chairs, and so like other people, I was scrunched pretty close to others in back-to-back couches. Behind me, however, was Brenda J Allen. She didn't see me, but I certainly saw her and I heard her. You see, Brenda was standing around a bunch of graduate students, some of whom she obviously didn't know. While the buzz around me was growing, I could only hone in on the conversation Brenda was having with a graduate student. You have to understand I'm the greatest of eavesdroppers as well. So let me try to recreate what I overheard. Brenda, is this your first NCA convention? The graduate student said, yes. Well, I hope you had a great time. I did, said the graduate student. Lots of interesting stuff I saw. Well, my name is Brenda J Allen, and of course it was Brenda J Allen. From the University of Colorado, I hope you plan on coming to other NCAs. And the student said, definitely. Well, you should also feel comfortable getting a hold of me. I'm in Denver, so look me up and feel free to ask me any questions. Here's my card, and drop me an email anytime. Helping. Remember that word, helping. Now let's go back a few decades as we briefly think about the legacy of Carroll C. Arnold. A Penn State professor, Dr. Arnold was trained within a rhetorical framework, but soon became intellectually curious about empirical work. He was instrumental in putting social science research front and center, and eventually became editor of speech monographs, which today, of course, we call communication monographs. One of our fields, of course, leading journals in and on empirical research. He also, interestingly, co-founded Philosophy and Rhetoric, which is another distinguished scholarly outlet. Despite his 8 books and over 50 scholarly articles, Dr. Arnold was also an outstanding teacher. His reputation as a teacher was outstanding as students would pack his classes to get what was called the Arnold experience. In fact, in 1997, a Spectral column by Richard Gregg noted that while at Cornell, Carroll taught one student to become more confident and to project her ideas more convincingly. That student today is known as Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In 1984, Carroll Arnold was selected to participate in what was then the first ever Teachers on Teaching, which I resurrected and reinstated this year in New Orleans. I guess past NCA President Sam Becker summed it up nicely in 1977, calling Carroll Arnold a teacher to our profession. Today, we welcome a new generation of excellence with Dr. Brenda J Allen. First, full disclosure, I don't know her very well. All I knew about her was that she's an outstanding scholar, an excellent speaker, an admired mentor, a very nice person, and from what I saw at Western, an excellent dancer. She's hot. She's hot. As I considered this year's Arnold Lecture invitation, it was important to me to think about someone whose voice honors that of the late, great Carroll C. Arnold. Brenda J. Allen is that person. Dr. Allen's scholarship tackles some very difficult issues, namely civil rights, inclusive discourse, and social identity. Her research has appeared in some of the best scholarly outlets, including communication monographs, the Journal of Communication and Communication Studies, among many, many others. Dr. Allen's recent book, Difference Matters, which is available from the Waveland booth, is an incredible amalgam of theory and life experience, which I believe is dedicated to understanding complex issues such as sexuality, gender, sex, race, and class. Yeah, real easy book to write, right? Several months ago, when I announced our Carroll Arnold speaker, I received an email from a former student of hers expressing great excitement about the selection. So I wrote him back, and I asked him to send me a few words about Dr. Allen. Here's what he said. Dr. Allen had a profound effect on how I view the world. She taught me that my worldview is not another's worldview. Coming from a farm town in Colorado, I was never taught to think differently. I swear I never thought there was one gay person in my hometown. Today, I think about it, and I know there's like dozens. As I finish my grad degree, I am indebted to Dr. Allen for bestowing upon me the belief that we are all humans first, then different kinds of humans. Please tell her also that I think her clothes rock. Today we honor and listen to the words of our Carroll Arnold speaker, the first person of color to be recognized. A great scholar, a great teacher, a great leader. Yes, our Carroll C. Arnold experience comes full circle today as we celebrate a great colleague who herself has also made a difference. There's a wonderful phrase in Spanish I learned a few years ago called entre bastidores, which means behind the scenes. Indeed, behind the scenes, we can only imagine the direct and indirect help that Dr. Allen has given to others. In her NCA TV interview in Chicago, when asked about her experiences participating in Scholar to Scholar, Dr. Allen told the interviewer, "I'm so humbled that people would even stand in line to speak with me." Well, listen, Brenda, we not only stood in line today, but we're now sitting here and we're very eager to listen to all you have to say. So I'm pleased and enormously proud to introduce the 2011 Carroll C. Arnold Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Brenda J Allen.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Rich, for inviting me. Thank you for this honor. I have been preparing for this presentation. Fortunately, I'm on sabbatical. Have I told you lately that I'm on sabbatical? And it's great that I'm on sabbatical because I've been able to immerse myself in this topic and have found it phenomenal and actually transforming for me, and probably will write a book about it. So this is major. I really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Pearson Higher Education for sponsoring this, Chris Ferguson for his graduate research assistants, the NCA members who sent me their research, Brenda Holmes, Theodis Hall, and Karen Lee Ashcraft, especially for their feedback and their support. I also thank those who developed this event in the memory of Carroll C. Arnold. I never met him, but I've heard nothing but stellar accounts of him as a fine human being. When I was in the 7th grade, that's right, I've always had it going on. When I was in the 7th grade, my junior high school teacher, music teacher, let's call him Mr. Hatch, his name was Mr. Hatch, asked me to sing a solo for our Easter program. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Well, we met to rehearse, And when he started playing the piano, he played the soprano line. And I sang it, but it just never felt comfortable to me. And I suppose it must have sounded well to him because we kept rehearsing, but I just never told him, this just doesn't feel like my voice. Well, the program time came, and it was played over the loudspeakers in our home room. And as I listened to that voice, and most of us feel, when we hear our voices recorded, it doesn't feel like us, but that especially did not feel like me. And for some reason, I couldn't say anything. They didn't say who had sung the song, and I didn't even tell anybody that it was me. I didn't even tell Ma. I called her when I was preparing for this and asked her if she remembered, and she said she didn't. And she asked me, so why did you not, say anything to him? And why did it feel so strange to you? And I just didn't know. So that was almost 50 years ago. And here we are 50 years later. And here I am as a critical communication scholar who studies organizations, who's interested in issues of social identity and social constructions. And I can look at that story based on what I've learned as a scholar and see implications for my talk today, voice lessons for social change. So social construction says, first of all, we need to think about the context. The year was 1963. It was my first year being tracked according to IQ in classes. Therefore, I was the only colored girl in all of my classes. Tom Luton was the only colored boy. And we were situated in a neighborhood about 2 miles from home, a middle-class neighborhood, white middle-class neighborhood. I had come from an elementary school that was right across the street from where I lived in the projects with all of my black friends, primarily black, except for one family that we called Puerto Rican. And I'm not sure now if that was actually accurate. So here I was in elementary school. I had been singled out by all my teachers were white there as well. I had been singled out, held up as, the bright one. I had always been compliant, always obedient. Yeah, I know it's hard for you to believe that at this point. But I was well disciplined, and I saw the teacher as the authority. So of course, now that I'm in junior high, the same thing happened. And in fact, that characterized the rest of my education until even through graduate school. So other contextual nuances may have mattered here. For example, the roles and the social identities. There was Mr. Hatch, a white middle-aged, presumably middle-class teacher. There was me, a colored female teenager, working-class student. The student body was about 50% white, 50% colored. And we became black probably about that year when James Brown said, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." And 98% faculty. So as you think about these issues, as social construction invites us to do, and you think about potential power dynamics, I ask some questions. Why did Mr. Hatch choose me? We'll never know his intent, but we can speculate. I assume that he was well-intentioned. Why he chose me may have been related to my combined race and educational status. Maybe it was my gender as well. Certainly many of my friends, both colored and white, sang well. Maybe he assumed my religious identity was Christian. It was not. I wasn't affiliated with a religion at that time. Many of the white kids in the school, in fact, were Jewish, and it was a public school. So it's interesting to consider having an Easter program in a public school and having a child sing a song, right, not knowing in terms of religious affiliation. And there I was, accustomed to obeying, to being compliant, to not contesting or challenging authority. It never, ever crossed my mind to challenge. So with that story in mind, it helps to establish the primary premise of what I want to share with you this evening. Communication scholarship about voice offers exciting ideas for how we, as members of the communication discipline, can affect social change. So what's the thesis? No, I'm kidding. Repeat after me. To discern voice lessons for social change, I read the research reports that many of you shared with me. I also reviewed related literature and I looked through the convention program, and I've just been so heartened to see the diverse and encouraging examples of how we are indeed working to transform local, national, and international communities. It makes me proud to be a member of this discipline. However, I think we need to look right where we are in terms of social change. We need to turn the lens inward in terms of higher education. So more specifically, how can we accomplish, through examining power dynamics, how we use communication to construct social identities within the academy? Now, by social identity, I mean any sense of self that's based on membership in any group. I'm most interested in social identity categories that are affiliated with groups that have historically been disenfranchised in the United States. So therefore, I'm interested in gender, sexuality, race, class, nationality, age, ability, religion. I'm also interested in terms of looking at the power dynamics. And for each of those categories, historically there have been groups that are going to be primarily privileged and those that are going to be primarily not be privileged, subject to oppression and discrimination. Now, regarding the social construction of social identities, my story raises a lot of questions relevant for us as members of the Academy. When do we feel as if we sound like ourselves or not? What contextual variables seem to matter? How does our sense of voice connect to our social identities? What roles do we act? As, in fact, if you think about Mr. Hatch, you think about little Brenda J, well, not so little, but cute. And smart. No, smart and cute. That's what you tell girls, right? But you think about the two of us in that context. You think about our roles. So if you were Mr. Hatch, right? What voice lessons were we taught as Mr. Hatches, okay? And what voice lessons do we teach? Whom do we choose as soloists? And on what do we base our choices? Whom do or might they represent? On what resources do we rely to select those songs? How much agency, if any, do we share or enact? What assumptions do we make related to all of these choices and others? How can or do we disempower or empower ourselves or others regarding their voice? Then you think about the role of Brenda J. And again, all of us have been Mr. Hatch. All of us have been Brenda J. So in terms of being Brenda J, what songs are we asked or expected to sing? For what purpose? In what key? And register? Using what media? When, if ever, do we choose to create our own songs or refuse to sing a song or invite or demand to collaborate to choose or create a song? Is there such a thing as a natural voice? To explore then the proposition that our discipline has powerful potential to affect social change in higher education, I'm going to explain why we should focus on higher education, look at some ways that organizational communication scholars have conceptualized voice, give an overview of scholarship in terms of voice and diversity, share a few lessons, and talk about how we might apply them. First, let me tell you what I mean by social change. I have a very straightforward definition of that. Any efforts that aim to transform society to think and act on behalf of solving social problems. And I believe that, and I know you know it too, that higher education is a prime site to do exactly that. Higher education is a crucial site of power dynamics and identity construction, and not just the construction of students. Social construction, in case you're not familiar with this perspective, says that we should understand that humans create reality through interaction. We derive our knowledge from mainstream discourses based on dominant value systems. And it encourages to question taken for granted knowledge about the world and therefore about ourselves. Relating voice to social construction, John Schotter asks, if the social worlds and realities in which we live are socially constructed, then at issue is whose voices do and do not play a part in the construction processes. So think about that question in terms of higher education. In addition to being a site of social construction for everyone who's part of the academy, higher education, unfortunately, is also a site with a history of discrimination, prejudice, exclusion, and you name an ism. Like most other organizations and institutions in the United States, within higher education, formal and informal policies usually dictate that members enact dominant norms, linguistic codes, and communication styles during everyday interactions, which can lead to discrimination and conflict. Paulo Freire asks and states a dilemma or a dichotomy, excuse me. Education either functions as an instrument to facilitate integrating the younger generation into the status quo and to conform, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. We can tend to maintain and reinforce the status quo as a discipline, or we can proactively seek to transform. Our discipline is uniquely equipped to either maintain or transform. And I'm sure you've heard, in addition to these reasons why higher ed matters, I'm sure you've heard some of the statistics and projections in terms of what's going on in the United States and around the world. These indicate that we will have to continue to be we will become more diverse than ever in terms of some of these social identity categories, such as race, nationality, ability status, first generation, immigrant status, you name it. Now the refrain here seems to be, get ready, there's going to be more of them coming. And while I agree that that really is an important issue, something for me, something morally and ethically is much more at key. We need to establish an environment where everybody who's part of that environment feels included. We also don't need to focus on a curriculum that's so you're ready for certain groups to come. The curriculum is just for that group, right? The curriculum needs to be one that no matter what students you have, you are preparing them to be humane, inclusive human beings within the world. And we need to consider that whoever comes, those will include students who are going to continue in the academy. So you need environments where people feel like, for one, they have a shot at that. You need environments where people feel like that's something they want to do. And let me tell you, we are not doing a good job of that. In terms of members of all those categories that I listed, non-dominant members of every single one of those groups do not tend to feel welcome in higher education. And now, what's the basis of my knowledge? Almost a quarter of a century of hearing people tell me personally about their experiences, including this morning, a young woman saying that she's struggling with thinking about staying in the academy. A young woman who self-identified as a black lesbian, right? Biracial lesbian. So she has a few different of those non-dominant categories happening. So we need inclusive climates for all members of higher education. Catherine Hendricks, Ronald Jackson, and Jennifer Warren stated very clearly, what we know about the changing demographic landscape of this country and effective confirming communication should be reflected in our classroom teaching, interactions with students and colleagues, and our research programs. So let me move from there to tell you a little about voice scholarship in my discipline, organizational communication. Now, scholars in most of areas of our discipline have written about voice, but what I'm going to do is focus on scholarship from organizational communication, and that makes sense because it's my area of study, but more important than that, it makes sense because higher education is an organization. And a simple definition of organizational communication is that we look at processes people use to make meaning in goal-oriented social collectivity, and that's what a university is. And there's been a wealth of research, of scholarship on voice in organizational communication. Most of it focuses on critical studies. And as you probably know, critical theory extends frameworks for looking at power dynamics in society in order to make the world more equitable. Seeks to liberate and emancipate members of non-dominant groups by exploring how and why people comply with dominant belief systems and how they and their allies resist those systems. Critical theorists seek to raise consciousness to help people realize, how does power operate? And organizations are sites of domination and exploitation, but the good news is they also can be sites of resistance and transformation. We enact power relations through a variety of interrelated communication processes. So I'm going to give you just a real quick tour through some of the scholarship from organizational communication about voice. It's not at all exhaustive, but I think it's a fair representation of what's occurred. In 1988, in one of the earliest references to voice, Marlene Fine presented a framework for multicultural communication in organizations. And she based that on the fact that at that time there was this kind of clarion call for change, similar kind of situation as it is now in terms of saying there's more women and there's more people of color entering the workplace. Now actually, white women, poor white women and poor women of color have always worked. The challenge was you were having white middle class women needing to go to work. In addition, so Marlene Fine, in giving this framework, said that we needed to be prepared. And she was right with that because she also talked about the persistent inequities that occur in terms of members of non-dominant groups. And so she said that we really need, in our research and organizational communication, to look at multicultural discourse. And she defined multicultural discourse as all voices retain their individual integrity, yet combine to form a whole discourse that is orderly and congruous, in much the same way that musicians create harmony through the combination of simultaneous notes to form chords. I would add that discord and cacophony can also be productive. She encouraged researchers to identify and understand the organizational experiences of different groups. In 1992, Dennis Mumby and Linda Putnam developed a seminal concept called bounded emotionality. Now, I confess I'm stretching a little because they don't necessarily refer explicitly to voice, but emotionality is key to voice. And they offer that because of the dominant ideology of rationality that pervades most organizations. That there's this notion of that emotions are not allowed, certain emotions, right? And so they said that they encourage the expression of a greater spectrum of emotions in organizational communication. In 1994, in an article entitled Gaining a Voice, Patrice Bazanel invoked the potential of feminist perspectives to engender empowered communication. She focused on traditional gender interactions during everyday interactions. And she offered an extremely compelling and important perspective in terms of countering traditional themes. So instead of competition, community. Instead of cause-effect and linear thinking, integrative thinking. Instead of separation and autonomy, connectedness. She advocates applying these feminist values in our theory and our practice. In 1995, yours truly, and I am yours truly, echoed the potential of feminist approaches in a call for adding race based on the dearth of race research in our field. I suggested feminist standpoint theory, inviting individuals to voice their everyday experiences and concerns from their own perspective to illuminate obscure aspects of the social order. In 1996, Dennis Mumby and Cynthia Stoll cited 4 central problematics that implicitly frame a sense of community and identity among ORCOM scholars. Those are the problematic of rationality, organization-society relationship, and voice. They contend that the issue of voice is integrally bound up with the relationship between communication, ethics, and democracy. Regarding voice, they ask, how can we provide insight into the practices of traditionally marginalized groups or forms of organizing? How can we show from a communication perspective that what appears natural and normal about organizational practices is actually socially constructed and obscures other organizational possibilities? In 1997, Robin Clare weighed in with an important perspective, a dialectic in terms of thinking about voice. She talks about voice and silence. She says, although voice is a metaphor with a political potential and as a valuable discursive guide for communication scholars, it also has limitations. Voice, she says, does not always win out. It is sometimes exercised in futility and sometimes at the expense of human life. So she offers silence as an alternative metaphor for describing what happens to oppressed or marginalized groups of people. Stanley Dietz in 1998 conceptualized voice as a political act within organizational environments that opens both the corporation and individuals to learning through reclaiming differences and conflicts overlooked or suppressed by dominant conceptions or arrangements. Now, all of these conceptualizations and perspectives related to voice infuse some of the research, especially critical research, on teaching and organizational communication. And we made substantial progress, especially in terms of women's issues and feminist approaches. But we still have work to do on those various other social identity categories that I mentioned earlier. And some people have leveled critiques of that. In 2003, Karen Ashcraft and yours truly, and I am yours truly, sought to stimulate systematic attention to racial dynamics of organizational communication. Observing that organizational communication scholars have worked diligently on organizing and organization as theory, we also observed that we're silent in terms of race. And because textbooks serve as the voice of a canon, we analyzed core organizational communication textbooks. And we concluded that those texts narrate race through the voice of whiteness, thereby preserving the normative power of organized whiteness. And we conclude with specific suggestions for revising the racial subtext of our scholarship. In 2007, Kirsten Broadfoot and Debashish Munshi wrote an article called Diverse Voices and Alternative Rationalities, Imagining Forms of Post-Colonial Organizational Communication. They self-identified as outsider refugees, and they critiqued Mumby and Stoll. They said that although we conduct organizational communication scholarship within a global context, we tend to perform and interpret from dominant Euro-American intellectual tradition, thereby privileging that tradition and related voices. They say diverse voices, if present at all, are still channeled through dominant Western loudspeakers, and Western notions of rationality silence any discussion of emotionality or subjectivity, both of which are crucial elements of diverse organizing practices. And they refer to post-colonial perspectives as means by which you could really look at these issues in a different way. Mumby and Stoll accepted that invitation to a dialogue, and they wrote a thoughtful response that gracefully engaged those criticisms. So to conclude this part of the talk in terms of scholarship and organizational communication studies, we have wonderful frameworks and perspectives and analytical frames that might help us understand some of the issues that I'm asking us to pay attention to and to make some changes about in the academy. However, most of the research is on organizations external to those in which most of us work and study higher education. And although higher education is a logical locale, organizational communication scholar Ann Nicotera contends that the experience of academic identity as a source of rich data about the human experience has been taboo with few exceptions. She advocates that we conceptualize our own scholarly enterprise as a human phenomenon worthy of study. She asserts that we can uncover latent ideologies in our academic endeavors by examining our own life experiences. And I agree. And that's why I want to turn now to voices from and about the margins. So, given this idea that identity and voice are tied to dominant belief systems that can empower and constrain us, I think we need to listen to the voices in our midst. I believe that a rich resource for understanding voice, identity, ideology is the scholars themselves. And I already knew that there were lots of autoethnographic essays written by scholars at the margins, and I already knew that many of them were quite compelling. But as I embarked on this study, I found so many more. And so I decided to focus on those kinds of publications in which scholars talk using autoethnographic approaches about their experiences in the academy. And from those, I wanted to discern issues in terms of voice. Now, I focus on scholars of color as kind of a, let's call it a pilot or exploratory research project to learn. The question would be, how do scholars of color describe their experiences in or related to academia? And what kind of power dynamics can we find? Now, before I share those lessons, I have to note that a divide tends to exist between theoretical and autoethnographic writing based on the conception of theory is abstract, objective, rational, and intellectual, God's eye, whereas autoethnography is confessional, emotional, provided mainly to position and legitimize non-dominant scholars' work. Bernadette Collefell and Shane Morman assert that some critics view such writing as poignant or narcissistic and vain, and some of it might be. But I turn now to voices from the margins, not to reproduce that perspective and its underlying assumptions based on dominant belief systems about which ways of knowing are more valuable. Rather, I intend to bridge these two approaches to understanding voice and identity and their relevance to higher education. And I offer these voices as theory, as ways of knowing and being. These voices provide rich insight into the very questions that we seek to understand about power and identity. As Marcia Houston has asserted, it's not enough that marginalized group members are members of the academy. It is also imperative that our voices and experiences are heard. So I'm going to share with you several snippets from the many articles that I read. And I have actually analyzed them for themes, but I'm not, for the printed version of this, you'll have that kind of information. But for purposes of time, and also because we really want to have time for question and answer, I'm going to forego sharing those with you. In reading through many of these articles, one of the things that I observed, as I've already pointed out to you, but I think it's important to punctuate, is that these are the same old songs. Again, same song, different singer. And as I share these with you, for some of you, they're going to resonate very clearly. For some of you, you may be tempted to say, but, I just invite you to listen and say, what if this is true? I invite you to listen with me telling you that it is true, that the ones that I've chosen do represent. They represent the voices. So these are not isolated. This is what happened to me, and no one else has experienced it. So here I stand once again, invited to be a soloist. This time I've been much more reflective about the opportunity. This time I'm singing in my own voice, which has been shaped by diverse sources of knowledge to which I have been exposed through formal and informal education and experiences. This time, with a raised consciousness gained from my espoused theories within my discipline, I have written my own song. This time, I'm not singing alone. This time, I have tuned into those countless voices across that quarter of a century I've been in the Academy that have shared with me their experiences that echo those that I'm about to share with you. And I'm so pleased to tell you that these voices are infused with issues that the organizational communication scholars have conceptualized regarding voice, emotion, silence, standpoints, dissent, and the feminist values that Patrice Bazanel highlighted. Moreover, they imply, suggest, and describe action, something for which critical theorists are often criticized. I was recently at Ohio University, and a graduate student asked, well, when do critical theorists really do something about what they've discovered? These voices epitomize how Eric King Watts characterizes voice. He says it's a particular kind of speech phenomenon that pronounces the ethical problems and obligations incumbent in community building and arouses in persons and groups the frustrations, sufferings, and joys of such commitments. As I read these, again, I invite you to hear what they have to say and to imagine the significance for how we might change higher education. And after I finish reading, I will roll the credits in terms of the voices themselves, and they're not in the order in which I read them. And then I would like for us to have a moment of silence in terms of reflecting and feeling and imagining the kinds of change we might make based on what these voices have shared with us. When we are silent too often, we start to lose our voices, our ability to speak out in defiance of mistreatment, of degradation, of humiliation, of pain inflicted on our and other bodies. Part of what I want to do as a teacher is to cultivate courageous voices that successfully speak in the face of oppression. My Black presence served as a filter to my knowledge, a barometer of thoughts, and tempered my interactions with those who would have me to act or not act Black, as if Black is equated with being militant and antisocial, as if Black equals anti-white, as if Black is being the oppressed and the oppressor, or those folks who wish me to engage in race talk, in hushed tones, the sanitized talk of academia for their ease, when in fact the scathing edges of their articulate tongues have often left me silenced and bleeding. A white female senior faculty member said to me, Chris, I'm a little concerned with you studying white kids. I mean, a white guy who studies white people just doesn't make sense. Searching for voices that are not already in our heads may help us to cross many social barriers. Autoethnographies are acts rather than artifacts. They do critical theory with unapologetic axiology, which predicates that we are in pain, we can ease the pain, and we can change. This used to be in my flesh as a code of caring and compassion. like placing my hand over my twisted ankle or reaching my hand out to someone who fell on a playground. Somewhere between the jungle gym and my thesis proposal defense, this ethical thing to do was schooled out as evidences of bias in my research practices. I was the angry woman of color before I even opened my mouth. Whether it be the continual complicity manifesting itself through silence from others who would be allies in the fight against inequality, but have the privilege of choice, I am tired. However, I'm the most tired of the blatant challenges to my presence. I hate the high-ranking administrator in my college who each time we meet asks if I have a PhD. In introductions to prospective students of color at recruiting functions, she always introduces my colleagues as doctor or professor while calling me by my first name. Each time she does this, I'm embarrassed and angered, feeling used once again. The demand to be both exemplary of diversity and yet in my place is taxing. Tired of being exemplary and exceptional for one moment, I would like to know what it feels like to be normal, like the majority of my colleagues. I thought it was hard being a graduate student of color, but this is unbearable at times. The only people like me are the undergraduates, but my connections with them are limited. They have to be. Otherwise, I'm unfairly read as deviant. We are attracted to a profession and discipline that inherently promises an openness to studying and teaching difference, yet more often than not, falls short of this promise. I've come to realize that even though I have always lived Chicana theory, I did not understand its power until I began teaching Chicana feminism. In my colored/foreignness, I am seen as an authority on culture. This stance both empowers me by creating a space from which I can engage my voice and trivializes me because my legitimacy as a scholar is couched in my presence, my body, not in my learning. A severed tongue does not grow back, but it can speak in new ways. I do not claim to speak for anyone other than myself, but I dedicate this effort to those for whom my voice resonates. Returning to my academic introduction to critical understandings of identity, the most valuable lesson that I learned was that I could write about people who looked like me in transparent, humanizing, and resistant ways. To be frank, this possibility brought tears to my eyes because if it were true, I could become an academic without having to leave the politically incorrect/taboo/prohibited pieces of me behind. I wallowed in isolation as I read, reread, and tried diligently to address the stinging evaluations of race-related work by people who largely felt as if the work was unproductive, ungeneralizable, unscholarly. One reviewer called my work journalistic or incomplete by itself. Why didn't you use whites as a comparative group? I'm not asking to be embraced by the discipline if such an embrace involves the expectation of assimilation. Individuals with a critical gaze should be sought after and recognized as assets rather than viewed as liabilities. Any chorus of conscience will have to find a way to make space for discordant voices. I close this section with a quote from John Warren, who left us earlier this year. In his book entitled Performing Purity, Whiteness, Pedagogy, and the Reconstitution of Power, he characterized his positionality and his work. It is an ethical position that does not deny scholars of color who preceded my voice, but adds my critical voice in harmony with those voices. To attempt to speak a language that moves people constituted in whiteness from a place of ignorance to a place where people question themselves and their world. This, he said, is my ethical responsibility. In an essay entitled Academic Families of Choice, Queer Relationality, mentoring, and critical communication pedagogy, Krishna Padisappu and Bernadette Calafell proclaim, John's voice speaks in and through all of us, encouraging us to negotiate our different and shared identities in the way strong families would during times of struggle. With all of our voices speaking together, John will never be silent. We ask you to join us in this mission so that we might all gain access to voice, so that we might speak across identity lines, helping us feel a little less like strangers to one another and a little more like family. So I'm going to move quickly through some of the lessons that I learned, and as I said, I've learned so many. One thing that was really exciting to me is that perspectives from organizational communication scholarship and perspectives from autoethnographic publications complement one another, and they provide insight and information for what I'm asking. I also saw that critical perspectives have been phenomenal sources of empowerment for scholars on the margins. So it's an interesting proposition and in fact it's pivotal in terms of my own growth and development as a scholar. I also learned that there's a wealth of insight and information from scholars of color that can be resources for teaching, research, and practice. They model reflexivity, and that practice includes the ways that we interact with one another in the hallways, the ways that we interact with one another when we're doing job searches, the ways that we interact with one another when we're doing personnel reviews, the ways that we interact with one another, and so forth and so on. A specific example comes to mind in terms of the potential for the bridging of these two perspectives on voice. Emotion matters. Recall that Putnam and Mumby talked about bounded emotionality as an important way to acknowledge dominance of the ideology of rationality. Remember that? This offers a way to study and think about how we actually, to think about how we are dealing with the issue of emotionality. And specifically, a scholar named Rachel Griffin has offered for us an approach that she calls critical love. Excuse me while I find the page. Good thing I numbered them. Yeah. Excuse me. Oh, this is bad. Okay. So what I'm going to do is tell you next steps, and as I do that, I'm going to look for that page because this is a key part of the presentation. So the next steps include that I would like for us to take what we have shared today to the next step. I would like for us not to let this be, okay, we came, we talked about these issues. I trust that I provided some insight and some ideas. I hope that I have inspired you and go on into our lives. So I've asked Richard West if I can have a session for next year in Orlando in which we continue this conversation, and he has agreed. Excuse me?
I'll make sure Steve Beebe knows about it.
Okay, I'm getting close to that, page 21. The other thing I would like for you to do is, how many of you have read there's an article by Kent Ono in which he talks about, he writes a letter to his mother, right? And he's talking about writing in his academic and in his academic and his personal voice. So what I'd like for you to do is to read that article, and I'll give you the actual citation for it, to read that article and then to write a letter similarly to what he did. And what I'd like for you to do with that is to actually send it to me. This is my website, www.differencematters.info. So send it to me, and I will read through those, and that can be part of this project of thinking about how we move forward. I'd also love to hear from you in terms of ideas for what might be the next steps, you know, if we think about these kinds of issues related to voice and social change. In addition, I would like for you to begin to listen to voices. Listen to the voices around you. Listen to the kind of voices that come up for you in various interactions with other people. And listen to understand. I'd also like you to expand your repertoire in terms of these issues. Now, you recall I focused on race, but you could fill in the blank in terms of the other social identity categories. Right? You can fill in the blanks. That for some of the things that those scholars were sharing, very similar for persons with disabilities, very similar for persons who are GLBTQ identified, very similar for social class issues. One of the references that you'll find in my printed version of this is from a graduate student from working class background who talks about her struggles in terms of class issues as a student. So these issues matter in a variety of ways. So that's another thing that I would like for you to do. As I said a moment ago, I want to offer a concept that Rachel Griffin has developed, which is a way that infuses emotion and critique. And it's a way that we can move forward in our quest to effect social change by starting where we are. She proposes critical love, explaining that, quote, an ethic of care rooted in critical love supports humanization, dialogue, and strong emotions such as fear, frustration, and anger. This type of love recognizes the pride and pain of humanness at the intersections of complex identities. It bears witness to ignorance, pain, suffering, suspicion, distrust, and conflict, and it allows for ugly, meaning acrimonious, crazy, and cynical discourse. She presents critical love as an act of intimacy that can compel listening, reflexivity, and humility to bridge differences. Critical love houses the potential for progressive growth toward building academic spaces that are more participatory and inclusive. One of the lessons that I learned and that I'm immediately going to take action about as I read through these voices is when I teach my Difference Matters course in organizational communication, I call it Communicating Power in the Ivory Tower. I have not incorporated scholarship from outside of the United States. but through reading some of the work, through talking with, in particular, a couple of students in some of these campus visits, I realized that I had been remiss and that my rationale of, well, I'm focusing on the United States is totally unacceptable. And what I like about those moments when I recognize where I'm falling short is I can have empathy for people who aren't. However, one of the guiding tenets in my classes is once you learn something, you're responsible for it. And so that's why I'm encouraging you to read some of these articles that I referred to. My website is going to have all of the articles that I read that are these autoethnographic descriptions in terms of people from the margins' experiences. So I encourage you to be proactive in terms of the kinds of lessons that you might learn as well. So I've told you some next steps. I've suggested some ways that we might actually affect change, social change, through thinking about where we are. I hope that you've gotten some ideas from those. Remember your assignments. I also encourage you to form and nurture alliances. This is something that also became very clear in terms of how many of these scholars from the margins are able to persist, form alliances. Many of the articles that I mentioned were actually co-authored. They were those collaborations. In conclusion, I go back to my experience with Mr. Hatch. I can easily offer critical love for both him and for me. If we had dialogued across our differences in race, class, age, gender, and level of education, perhaps I would have told him that the soprano line didn't feel natural, and I didn't want to sing that song because I couldn't relate to it. Maybe he would have explained that he chose me because I have an extraordinary soprano voice that, if cultivated, would lead me to become a phenomenal opera singer. Maybe he would have explained that he chose the song because it's a Negro spiritual, which black slaves in the United States often use as codes to communicate. That could have marked a turning point in my life. Instead of becoming a critical organizational communication scholar, I might have become a famous opera singer. Oh well, that didn't happen. Instead, I stand here before you today as someone who has the benefit of the variety of ways of knowing and being, who has the benefit of having relationships and having phenomenal experiences across the borders and the center and so forth. And so I encourage you, as you move forward, that you help to create those kinds of bridges and that you actually focus on how we can affect change in higher education through looking at, listening, and expressing voice in equitable ways.
By yourself because we're out of time in the question.
Yeah, we're out of time. Let's go. That's fine. Yeah.
We actually could make time, but I have a feeling with 500 people we would have more than one or two questions. So what Dr. Allen has graciously agreed to is to answer any kind of questions one-on-one, or obviously to email her or respond as you see the convention evolve here. From our hearts, thank you for sharing your heart today.
Thank you.